welcome back to our politics. Now, strongman politics is chipping away at women's rights. That's according to one of the founders of a group of female world leaders who penned an open letter signed by more than 24 dignitaries. It says, quote, above all, we seek to underscore that the risk posed by politics that seek to halt and erode gender equality is a risk not only to women, but also to all of humanity, because half the population is prevented from contributing to its full potential. Now, the letter comes as the appeal for populist politics rises around the world, from the elections of Vladimir Putin to Donald Trump to Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. Now, the strongman style of leadership is seen to be growing support. All right, let's go now and talk to a former UNESCO Director General and Bulgarian politician, Irina Bokova. She's one of the co-founders of the movement behind the letter, and she's joining us now from Paris. Ms. Bokova, thanks very much for being on the program. I think, okay, first of all, what I'd like to ask is, how is this idea of strongmen politicians, macho politicians, and populist politics undermining women's rights?
Well, thank you for inviting me to express what we think about the sleep of the gender, I would say, agenda nowadays. Let me say that already our appeal has been joined by 33 former women leaders in the United Nations, heads of agencies, former prime ministers, presidents, funds, programs, and the secretary generals, because we are worried about, first and foremost, the undermining of multilateralism. And multilateralism has contributed enormously to the agenda of women's rights as human rights. We should not forget that it was thanks to the United Nations, to the multilateral platforms, that we have the Beijing Action Plan. We have also Resolution 1325 of the Security Council on women, peace and security. We have the goal number 5 on the Agenda 2030 on gender equality. And we have, of course, reduced child mortality, maternal health, access of girls to education. And now when we see that this multilateralism is undermined, in fact, it means also undermining of all the efforts for women's rights and women's empowerment. And we all, with Susanna Malcora, Helen Clark, my friends and former colleagues that started this initiative, we are all alarmed of what is happening.
Yeah, you are talking about the undermining of women's rights. So going back to that point, I do want to know, because we see a rise in the trend in populist politics and strongman, so-called strongman macho leaders. How does this contribute to the deterioration of equality, of gender equality?
Well, actually, this type of, I would say, of backtraction on women's rights very often are expressed in kind of populist approaches, very often linked with nostalgic overtones about time when, in fact, women did not enjoy these rights. And we do believe that we have to turn the tide, that we have to resist, we have to counter this narrative, because we think women's rights is not just an agenda for women. It is for all the societies, for communities. At the end of the day, it's about social inclusion and social justice, I would say. Everybody should contribute to a society's well-being. And this is what we see nowadays undermined by the rise of such populist trends.
All right, just very quickly, Ms. Bokova, how do you push this agenda forward? What solution do you see? Just very, very quickly.
Well, you see, we are just a broad network of women who care, who are not indifferent, who are alarmed, who have contributed to the elaboration and adoption of this agenda. I think we need to make very strong advocacy. We need to go and talk to these leaders. We need to mobilize the civil society. And also, I believe with our experience, with our kind of a moral authority also, we can do a lot more in the future to turn the tide about this politics.
All right. Thank you very much for your insight there, Ms. Irina Bokova. She's the former UNESCO Director General and a Bulgarian politician. Now, joining me in the studio to discuss this is messaging expert and director of Red Thread Communications, Laura Shields. And still with us is Shada Islam from Friends of Europe, as well as British MEP William Dartmouth. All right. I'd like you, Laura, to react first to what Ms. Bokova there was saying, this undermining of women's rights by the rise of the kind of rhetoric that we see, which is across the world. It's not just in Europe.
Well, on the rhetoric, I think you are right. When it comes to strong men, I think it's important to differentiate between strong men and strong leaders.
Sure.
Because everybody wants strong leaders. I mean, who doesn't want a strong leader?
Or macho politics,
exactly.
another word to
But
say.
strong men are associated with certain qualities. They very much engage in us and them. So whether it's gays, anti-Muslims, fear of the outsider, you know, in Putin's case, the whole strongman narrative was built largely to mask the fact that the Russian economy was doing very badly and that internationally the country's being marginalised. In Hungary, you've seen Orban using sort of, well, George Soros. I should imagine George Soros, their hatred of George Soros probably unites all of the strongmen. And then also Bolsonaro very famously had supporters who ran a disinformation WhatsApp group basically talking about gay kids in schools. So they do us and them. They talk in very toxic, inflammatory language a lot of the time. But the key thing to understand in all of this is that whilst a lot of people find this appealing, if you don't like it and you want to manage it, the best thing to do is not to react to it. And a lot of the time, we don't see people reacting very carefully or intelligently to this kind of language. They just pour petrol on the flames.
So I will ask William, a man, what is the appeal of strongmen and macho politics from your point of view?
Well, I don't think it is so appealing, and I'd also
you don't think it's appealing?
I'd also make the point. I'd also make the point that over the years there have been many very strong female leaders. As I said before, I'm an old timer, and I remember Mrs. Mayer, Mrs. Gandhi, and certainly Mrs. Thatcher from my own country. And actually, I think that those three were probably stronger than any male leaders have been. And I also think that the lady in the film mentioned child mortality. I don't think that President Bolsonaro of Brazil wakes up every morning and say, I want to increase child mortality. I don't think it's like this. The fact of the matter is that women are more equal, and rightly so, than they ever have been at any other time in human history. And I think that this is basically a mistake. And if you disagree with particular leaders, you want to disagree with them on the merits of their policies, as I do. And not just call them names. I just don't think it's very productive.
But also,
I don't think it's very productive.
But also, William, when Bolsonaro or others wake up in the morning, they don't say, yes, so many children will die. They say women should not have their rights. Birth control, health situation, they don't worry about that. That is very important. Women's rights should be at the center of our policies, whether it's development policy, whether it's foreign policy, defense policy. Countries are spending more on arms, on weapons, than they are on health and education. They're not worrying about the kids. 130 million children, Tessa, girls, children, do not go to school. They're going to grow up to be disempowered women. We need to get those girls in school. And Ms. Bukova is right about a narrative, but it doesn't have to be a counter-narrative. We need to have a positive narrative, a really powerful narrative about how women matter to the economy, to the politics, to the business, to every single
Rather than a gain for women is a loss for men or something like that.
And it is very fundamental to all our policies. We need to get real with that, William. Sorry, we need to recognize there is a pushback by these so-called strong men.
And Laura, I'd like to go back to you on imaging, because we saw there Vladimir Putin, you know, with really a macho image. But is this all about form and messaging, or is there something to be said about the politics, the substance of the politics, and what people believe that these men can bring as answers to the problems they see in society?
Well, I think strong men deal in sort of very black and white stereotypes about the world and visions of power, you know, protection frames and strength frames. Strong fathers are obviously incredibly appealing to their base. And actually, if you think about it, whenever President Trump is feeling a bit vulnerable, what does he do? He goes off and does one of his massive rallies where he fires up his base because it gives him strength. I think if you're going to move it away from that, though, I completely agree with what Shada was saying. But if you look at the United States, in the midterms, there was a wave, or a blue wave, and a lot of those were women. And they weren't just women who were fighting on women's issues. And in fact, if you run on women's issues, or
probably will
rights,
lose.
You will lose. But when you run a very local campaign, which really connects with what people want, and you listen to them, and you find common ground, which is not the same thing as centre ground, the candidates that did the best, whether it was in Kansas or in New York, are the ones that really understood that and were mixing their own personal story in with the policy aspects, and also talking about bread and butter issues like childcare, caring for the elderly, and work. And all of these things really make a difference. So if you want to fight strong men and macho politics, you don't fight them by pouring fire onto the flames. You do it by communicating on issues and being very practical and very focused and not reacting.
The fact that you say that there's something to fight against, does that mean that masculinity is appealing?
No, I don't. Yes, I do think. I think there is a certain and I would also say that this kind of masculinity does appeal to men and to women.
Sure.
I also think when people are worried about things, it's understandable where this comes from. But also, in terms of what William was saying before, women vote far less than men. So one of the reasons why we see the rise of strongman leaders is probably yes, women do vote for them, but they don't vote as much. And actually, if you look at somewhere like Hungary, Orbanism is a direct threat to female empowerment. I mean, only last week, a couple of weeks ago, he announced these tax breaks for women who have more than 4 children. You know, they would be taken out of tax. He has also consistently portrayed women working or women with children working as being anti-family friendly. Now, so in that sense, that if more women come out and vote, they generally make better choices for themselves and their children. And so that's why it's really, really important that more women do get out and vote. But they also need the kinds of people that they would vote for. That's not necessarily women. But it needs to be something that represents their needs more.
All right. William, would you like to react to what Laura was saying in terms of fighting this with issues-based politics?
Well, I actually agree with 95% of what you said.
What's the 5%? What's the 5%?
Which is a bit of a worry. I won't be asked again. Basically, I think that the film we saw earlier on, it's a bit of a cul-de-sac, which is actually being put forward. Certain people, as has always applied in politics, have certain views and certain ways of putting things forward, and certain views, and they've got to be countered with actually differing views, and that's exactly what you said. Now, the fact of the matter is that everyone's obsessed with President Trump, but a majority of I can't use the word white, a majority of white college-educated women voted for Trump. I mean, that is the fact. What does that tell you? And perhaps we'll talk about it. It tells you something was wrong with the Clinton campaign, is what it tells you.
Well, it does, yes.
Oh, well, that's what we're going to talk about perhaps in a moment.
Chad, we don't have much time.
I just want to say something about these so-called strong men. They are really quite weak because they rely on oppression and repression and simple messages. And they do not have the confidence of their people, many of them.
Under every strong man is an insecure little boy.
It's a very insecure little boy.
On that